Hey, you're listening to the Victims and Villains podcast, a podcast extension of the nonprofit that educates and engages individuals on mental health awareness through pop culture. I'm Black Nerd Magic, and on this episode, we are talking about 1998's Half Baked. Hope you enjoy.
Because like we talked about in our episode with Love What I Love podcast, Andy and Masha for Good Burger this past week as well, Kenan and Kel really helped shaped and had such an impact on my sense of humor. And then you hit puberty and Comedy Central had all these like edgy shows, and Chappelle's Show was my introduction to Dave Chappelle. And so Dave Chappelle, it's fitting that we're following Good Burger with Half Baked, because I don't know about you, but Dave Chappelle definitely had a impact on my sense of humor as a adult.
I'm the same way. Chappelle's Show was kind of my introduction to the kind of, I would say, slapstick comedy routine shows that we constantly got. Like, I know there's a lot of people who are obsessed with Jeff Foxworthy and Larry the Cable Guy, and Chappelle's Show kind of felt like that show that really took it to a next level. And I would say that I wasn't exactly a fan of it at first, because I was more into the animated shows at the time. I was kind of like a South Park guy. I was kind of into Family Guy, a little bit of The Simpsons. But watching Dave Chappelle and his show and how he was able to take a lot of the things that were happening in pop culture around the time and make funny bits out of it, I mean, it was revolutionary. And also, it was just laugh out loud funny. I mean, I can still remember the episodes with Rick James and Charlie Murphy, where they're detailing all of these stories, crazy stories that happened in the 80s. And, you know, even the little skit featuring Prince when he was playing basketball and everything that a lot of people who watch the show would know about. And, I mean, and also, even Chappelle even bringing on musical artists to perform. I remember there was an episode where he brought on Common and Kanye West to perform before Kanye was even Kanye. And it was just a great blend of pop culture, intelligence, and it doesn't get stale, and it never got old. I mean, you can still go right now and pop on a Chappelle Show episode and still laugh your butt off.
Oh, yeah, and it's because of Chappelle's Show that I had... I'd even known that Eddie Murphy had a brother, Charlie Murphy, and I remember him being one of the very few celebrities like I grieved for when they died, because like for me, like I grew up with him. I loved Chappelle's Show so much, and to this day, like I still will just randomly quote it every now and then. And most of them come from the Rick James episode, I'm not gonna lie. But yeah, like you know, Ashley Larry and just a lot of like the other characters that were so ingrained in that show, like you said, like it's really intelligent, and it's really just, his sense of humor has such a wisdom about it, but yet it makes you laugh and it makes you think at the same time, which I feel like you can't say that about a lot of comedians. At least I don't think so, because I'm not really like one that like leans in and like follows like stand-up comics and like certain comedians. Like Chappelle's Show just happened to kind of be one of those shows that was like a monumental force for like our age growing up, and so that was the reason that like I was so engrossed in that show. And you know, that's the reason why he's has such a profound effect on me as a in my sense of humor, kind of moving from teenager into adulthood. And I think you get to see a lot of that in Half Baked as well. This is the first time I'm watching Half Baked. And you see a lot of that stuff in Half Baked, because there's almost like a PSA element to Half Baked, and we'll get into talk about it. But you know, a lot of the later stuff that you would see with Chappelle's Show, you see in Half Baked.
Yeah, for me, watching Half Baked was also my first time as well. I hadn't heard so much about it as being like the comedy for stoners, a comedy that reveled in its love and also explaining about some of the intricacies about marijuana. And also kind of tampering down and tearing down some of the stereotypes that are associated with it, but in a satire, comedic way. I mean, there are a lot of deep things that are going on in this movie. I mean, for one, they talk about the discrepancy for how drug dealers unfairly get these long sentences in prison for just selling drugs. They even talk about how is weed addictive or not, or like, hey, do all people who are stoners, are they really all lazy, or are some of them productive? Are some of them just very creative when they use the drug? I mean, and they even talk about these guys, because Chappelle and the supporting characters, they're playing these guys who are kind of living these lives kind of very unfulfilling. I know that Chappelle, his character, he's like a custodian at like a corporate building, and one of his friends works in fast food, and one of the other guys works in a record store, but he loves it because he gets to talk about records while being high. And the guy who works as a kindergarten teacher, he probably has the best job out of all of them. But there's a sense that these guys, they have a carefree sense of looking at the world. Like, they don't take themselves too seriously, and they don't take the world too seriously. Like, for them, it's not all about, being so gung-ho about achieving this and achieving that, which for other people may look like, oh, they're living below their standards. But for them, they kind of just see life as kind of like this game, and they are in the bond of their friendship and just the way that they can spend time together and care about one another. It's kind of actually a beautiful thing about this film, outside of the comedy.
I know we're gonna like get into some of like the like our personal connections to some of the themes in this movie, but before we get like really like heavily deep into this, can we talk about one of the best scenes in this movie being how he's describing like all the stoners once like Mr. Happy Guy gets going, and he goes, and then you have the scavenger stoner, and then like they go light up the joint, and out up rises Tupac or Snoop-Dogg out of nowhere. And my wife was just casually watching it with me, and we both just were like almost in tears laughing at his cameo. It's so memorable. And then of course you also had Jon Stewart at the time, but like Snoop Dogg, who's been such an advocate for marijuana for so long, if not his entire career, definitely makes such a impactful cameo in this one, as one of the funniest parts of this movie.
Oh yes, that scene was great because then they talk about how there's the after school stoner, the kid who spends his whole parent's allowance on just getting high, and then there's also the dad, the 40-year-old parent who still wants to get high just so he can relate to his kids, and then there's the creative stoner, the person who thinks that the only way they can tap into the creative juices is by getting high. And I mean, it's so great because you hear often about these stereotypes. You hear often about people who say, hey, I only smoke weed for this and that. I only will use it if it's for me to like think about things clearer. Like, I know people who watch movies like we do, people who watch movies while they're high so they can gain a better understanding about the film. And some people have reported to me that watching films while they're high, which I often don't really recommend, they say that it works well for them.
I'm curious as to why you don't recommend it. Just peeling the curtain back.
Yeah, I'll peel a little bit of the curtain back. Okay, so for me, I think in the last year or so, there was a time where I did, get high, and I would go to the movie theater and watch new films. And I can tell you from a certain standpoint, it does expand your horizons as far as looking at the complexities of a film, understanding the subject matter, understanding the characters. It's kind of a way that opens up your brain to more possibilities of understanding a piece of art. But also, they talk about in the film that when you're a stoner, it sometimes can mess with your memory, and you kind of forget things. So also, I wouldn't recommend it in that aspect, because sometimes you'll watch a film while being high, and then the next 5 minutes you'll be like, hey, let me rewind that and see what's going on. So I wouldn't really recommend it, and I kind of have stopped and stepped away from that because it kind of hurts my viewing experience. But for other people, it works for them, and more power to them, I guess.
Are you saying that people should get high in order to understand Christopher Nolan's Tenet? Because I feel like in recent memory, like that's like one of the ones that like most people have just kind of like looked to and be like, I don't understand it. Like, what did I just witness? What did I just watch? But from your vantage point of like weed enhancing movies, maybe people will understand Tenet.
I would say, hey, it wouldn't hurt to try. I mean, there have been times where I have rewatched the film while being high, not getting overly high, but just to a certain comfortable point. And I will say it does enhance the experience. I mean, it does a lot into helping you see things that you didn't see the first time. And that may be the value of rewatching a film and already having experienced what's going to happen. But as far as the case for Tenet, I don't know if I will ever understand Tenet. And I don't think anybody will ever understand it unless they're like scholarly and unless they're like doing dissertations on it and just watching a constant loop marathon on it and trying to catch every detail. That is a tongue twister, brain teaser film, if I could say.
Yeah, totally agree. Tenet's one of those movies that I've seen probably 3 or 4 times now, and every time I see it, I am just constantly learning new stuff about that movie. I love to just... It's one of those movies that, like you said, like it's very scholarly. You want to like study it and kind of like get behind Christopher Nolan's brain with it. I digress. Stoner movies. Half-Baked. So I have never... Actually, I'm going to put this to disclaimer. I probably should have started with this disclaimer. But disclaimer, I typically don't like stoner movies. And I don't like stoner movies just because I don't really like irrelevant humor. It's really hit or miss for me, for one. And if you want to engage me in a stoner comedy, I'm all for it as long as I can be engaged with the plot. And so this film, I would hold it like with like Pineapple Express. I love Pineapple Express, and but I'm also coming from a point of someone that has never been high and has no desire to be high just because of personal reasons that I'm not going to get into on the podcast. If you would like to know more, you can message me on Instagram at Captain Nostalgia, and I'll be happy to answer any questions. But for just the privacy of the people involved, I'm just going to leave it very ambiguous. So this movie kind of is like something that I never really entertained the thought of, actually doing something like this on the podcast. And it's like, well, in that sense of mine, I just want to put an apology out there that we are basically like with that mindset, like just saying like no to an entire demographic of people. I don't want to condemn anyone for smoking weed or, you do you, bro. Like, but I really do. I've learned a lot over the last couple of years about being around communities and people that smoke weed, because like you said, like I think that there's a lot of Hollywood stereotypes that lead people to believe that, stoners are lazy, dumb, just, hungry and munchy just all the time. And that's just not the case. I've been around people and I've worked around people that it has, benefits for their anxiety. It keeps them calm. It keeps them engaged and helps them literally function. I've seen people that smoking marijuana and function completely fine, and then I've seen them 100% sober and they just don't know how to do basic things, for lack of a better word. And I think that this film really opens up the conversation to start breaking down a lot of those stereotypes that have come from Hollywood even after this movie.
Yes, because you got to remember during this time, 1998, when Half Baked was out, I mean, marijuana was still that drug that anti-drug PSAs were centered around. I mean, they talk about in the film how the character of Mary Jane, Dave Chappelle's character's girlfriend, love interest, she talks about how marijuana is a gateway drug. It's almost like Mary Jane is she's the manifestation of the DARE movement. You know, you remember DARE back in the day.
Yeah.
You had the black shirts and, you know, the red lettering, say no to drugs, and, you know, marijuana, you know, once you do this, you're going to end up doing cocaine, and then that's going to lead to heroin, and then, you know, your life's going to be ruined. I mean, that's pretty much, this was during a time where there was a lot of propaganda about just how bad marijuana was, and there wasn't a lot of education about the effects of it. You know, you kind of were getting your knowledge from like these politicians who had an axe to grind and who had like constituents to please when it came to passing certain drug laws and keeping certain offenders in prison. I mean, I brought it up a little bit earlier in the podcast, but this movie kind of goes into how there was a scene where Chappelle's talking with Mary Jane, and they're talking about her father. She said, yeah, my father, he's a drug dealer. He's where he belongs. He's in prison. And then Chappelle asks, like, well, for how long? She's like 4 years. And then Chappelle's like, 4 years for selling weed? And, you know, I mean, we have seen that there are still people who are losing their lives in prison, who are in prison for the rest of their lives just for selling a tenth of weed. Like, a drug now that is like legalized almost everywhere, and like you can go into a store and buy it and be able to consume it at home if you live in a state that has legalized it. But these same people who sold it back in the day are still like deteriorating in jail, and it kind of brings you to this whole dichotomy about what's going on here. You know, what's going on to where like people who have killed somebody, they're able to get out of jail before the person who was just selling a gram of weed. I mean, it's kind of like dark humor in a way and very tragic.
Well, that goes to some of what we were talking about last year during our Black Lives Matter episodes, where we were talking about the 3 strikes rule that was established in the mid 90s. I don't really remember which episode it was, but one of the documentaries we covered last year was addressing how they were basically trying to fill up more prisons, and so you got harsher drug sentences. And I think it's funny now that this movie is a little bit dated in certain ways, but there's a scene where Chappelle brings up, or Thurgood brings up this like pound of marijuana to the scientist guy where he works, and says, yeah, the FDA wants us to test on the medicinal effects on marijuana on people. And now I don't know how it is in where you are, but I know here in Virginia we are just a couple of weeks away from like weed being like recreationally legal. And we've started to see states that open up now, and now you're starting to kind of see a reversal of what was put in motion all those years ago. But even placing someone in prison for like you said, like a tenth of weed, like you're stealing away from that person's life regardless for a very minor offense. But it was made major because of some of the ways that laws were written.
Yeah, I mean, from here, what I'm seeing in my state is I think Washington was actually one of the first states that came across on the trend of legalizing weed. And I think it's because now there's a greater understanding of what it does and also what it doesn't do. Many people have talked about how, why don't we look at weed at the same way that we look at alcohol? Like, how can we criminalize weed? Because weed for a long time was a Schedule I drug. It was like the worst kind of drug you have. It was in the same level as cocaine and heroin. But when you look at the deaths and the pain and some of the billions of dollars it costs for people who are affected by alcohol, it doesn't get treated that way. I mean, we see at jobs, people are willing to test you for marijuana, but some person could come in drunk and not be and they get their people will look the other way. And, you know, it's all about really how you use it and if you use it responsibly. Now, I'm not saying that there's no way that you can't become addicted to weed, because you can. I mean, I've seen people who, like you said before, people who can't go a day without smoking it because they need to function. So there is a way that you become psychologically addicted to it. But also, you know, on the other hand, weed comes from the earth. It's an herb. You know, weed has been around since the beginning of civilization. They used to use weed for everything. I mean, hemp is what they used to call it back in the older days. They used to use hemp for rope. You know, they used to use it for a lot of things. I mean, weed was actually a luxury drug for the upper class in the 1800s. And, you know, people used to use it all the time with no restrictions. But it was only when Mexicans came here to the United States and Mexicans started to become criminalized, you know, and put in jail because they were smoking weed. And then that's when you started to see the laws come in about prohibiting weed and saying that weed was such a bad drug and that if you're on weed, you'll end up killing your whole family, which is all part of propaganda. I mean, have you ever seen the film or heard of the film Reefer Madness?
I have not.
Okay, so Reefer Madness, it was a film that was made in the 1930s, and pretty much it was like the anti-marijuana film. Like, one time when I was in college, me and my friend just sat down one day, we was on Netflix, and we was scrolling by, we saw this film, and we was like, you know what, let's just watch this film, because I was kind of curious, like I always am when it comes to movies. And we watched it, and literally this whole film was pretty much just telling you, just telling you how bad weed was, and that if you smoke weed, you're going to end up killing people. You were going to end up like causing harm to many people. Like, it pretty much said that if a person used weed, they were the spawn of Satan. That's pretty much what the information was back then about weed, and that carried on and on until like the 90s and the 2000s. Like, many people, my parents, I grew up with my parents telling me, hey, never touch weed. You know, hey, never, like, if you have a friend that uses weed, stay away from them. Don't hang out with them. So I think now, you know, thankfully, with the internet and everything, people have been able to bring about more awareness and be able to educate themselves about drug use. You know, not just weed, but with other drugs. And I'm not advocating for anybody to use drugs. Trust me. I'm not saying that. I'm just saying that when it comes to things like marijuana and things like that, it's better to educate yourself instead of allowing yourself to become a victim of propaganda.
No, I 100% agree, and I believe as you're describing it, I believe one of the documentaries we discussed last year actually addressed that and kind of the history of how that documentary really played into our psyche as a nation and really helped kind of shape how we see marijuana and other drugs as well. It kind of almost had the same exact impact that Birth of a Nation did for so long, how we viewed black people. And to your point, it's still crazy to me. You know, I've had to do a lot of growing myself just because I've had to separate my own experiences with the actual scientific facts. And you'd mentioned like alcohol and weed kind of being almost in the same exact category. Well, not saying it's not possible, but what are the statistics for someone that is drinking and driving and killing the person that they're hitting versus someone that is high under the influence and killing someone, high under the influence of marijuana. But it to an extent it can be, like Mary Jane said, a little bit of a gateway drug. As humorous as it is, I love the Bob Saget scene from here, where he goes to rehab and he's like, you ever suck coke for dick? No, I have. That's when you have an addiction. And to your point about people having the psychological addictions, those addictions, an addiction is an addiction, period. Whether it's a physical manifestation, psychological, or whatever. And something that someone who's addicted to controversial. This is a great example, but like. When you look at how the brain processes pornography, and how when a person has an orgasm, how the brain releases endorphins. Those endorphins are the same exact high as someone that is experiencing, I believe it's cocaine. Don't think it's heroin, but it's cocaine, I believe. Don't quote me on this because I'm literally just doing this from memory. I don't have any of this information in front of me, but when we first started Victims and Villains, one of the very first stories we talked about back when we were doing news was Pamela Anderson's open slander to the pornographic community. And she basically said that, porn was the equivalent of cocaine, and it can be to an extent of an addiction. It's a great way of looking at it. Yes, you might be a little bit more desperate to get the cocaine than and be willing to sacrifice a lot more than you would be for pornography, but an addiction and how the brain processes that addiction and how the body too also processes it, it's almost the equivalent. It might vary from substance to substance or vice to vice, but in the end, that psychological feeling that you're feeling, dependency to weed, is the same as, like, say, pornography or cocaine.
Yes, addiction can come in so many forms. I mean, for me, I consider myself addicted to watching film. And I think we're both in the same ballpark when it comes to that. If it comes down to it each day, if I don't get a chance to at least watch one film, then I'm kind of irritable. I'm kind of feeling like a little bit moody and everything, and not moody to the point where I'm going to tear someone's head off, but it's like it feels like there's a void missing. And I think that's what happens to anybody when it comes to being I guess I'm trying to find the right word, being like dependent on something. And they talk about in the film about weed addiction. We see Chappelle's character Thurgood. He talks about, like, hey, when Mary Jane comes in his life, he's like, hey, like, I'm just selling it, but I'm going to stop smoking. I can stop it. And and we see, like, the other guys, his friends, they have no plans of really stopping it. And you can see that they really love it. They really love doing it, and they depend on smoking it every day to really, like, have some fun. And I think it's become kind of routine, and that's how addiction unfolds. It becomes kind of a routine. It's like almost like waking up and brushing your teeth or putting on clothes. That's what addiction is. You kind of have to do this thing every day in order to feel whole. And for weed, it might not, there's never been a person that we've seen who has overdosed on weed, but also there's comes a point when if you use something and do something over and over again, it's not the same as it was in the beginning. They always say when someone who does a drug, if they keep taking it, they're trying to find that first high. It's like someone who uses crack and they experience that first high. They're going to keep trying to more and more crack in order to try to get that first high again. And they never will, because your brain's already used to it. And that's the same thing with weed. With weed, like, the first time you smoke it, it's like a whole different experience from any time you smoke it afterwards. Yes, you may still get high, but it's not the same as it was before. And there are other people out there who may use it and are trying to search for that high. And then there are also other people who use it because they want to use it. It's fun to use it. It makes them productive. It helps them go through every day. It helps them maybe with their anxiety and depression. And for me, I can't fault them for that. Like you said, do you. Hey, if you like it, I love it. But if it becomes to a point where you just really, where your body is just so dependent on it to where you have to do it, like you're thinking about doing it even when you're not doing it, then that's where the issue comes in. And we see in Half Baked towards the end, with Thurgood is Mary Jane's telling them, like, hey, are are you going to quit doing this? And he's like, yes, I have this joint in my pocket. Let me go ahead and like throw it out. But then the joint grows a face and stuff. It's like, hey, no, just do it one last time. This one last time. Trust me, it will be okay. And that's how addiction is. Like you tell yourself, hey, I can quit it. I can quit this if I want to. It's not a big deal. But if you find yourself like, when it comes time to quitting, being like, hey, you know what? It's not so bad. I can go ahead and do this. I can just go ahead and quit tomorrow. And then tomorrow just ends up becoming never because you're just stuck on being dependent on it.
Yeah, and your body grows to that addiction. It rises. When you're introducing your body to something new, like, say, coffee, or a caffeine period. I've tried in the past to like detox my body and just kind of like get away from caffeine for a day and just drink water and just flush my system out, and my entire body begins to shut down. Like my head just becomes overtly just painful and heavy. It feels like lead at certain points. My stomach just explodes. Literally, it's so painful, and that is because my body has become acclimated to having caffeine every single day. It is accustomed to having that first cup of coffee in the morning, and the film, Close to Your Point, even explores in the beginning, the first high versus every other time after that. I love that prologue where they're kids and they're kind of like talking about their like rituals as to how they try it, smoke together, and it's kind of like this almost like communal, like spiritual experience. It is how the film portrays it. But yeah, to your end where he's like standing on the bridge and he's saying goodbye to the joint. That's a perfect depiction of how addiction is. You've become so dependent on it. And there's even a line where when Kenny gets in jail for the first night, he mentions that the weed is starting to wear off, and he has to he basically has to live completely sober in the reality that Nasty Nate wants everything to do with him. And, the Squirrel Master has, protection, but that protection is only good. Like, he has to deal and confront that reality. And, again, like, addiction has cost, and addiction is something that can really mess you up in the long run. And then you can also have addictions that you can function completely in. But eventually, I believe, I would dare say, at least from my own experience, that addiction is going to hurt at least someone along the way.
Yeah. Sometimes people don't understand like how their choices can affect others. And, we see it with Thurgood and Mary Jane. He doesn't see how his addiction to weed, is affecting her. She had a father that went to jail for selling weed. And while we can talk about how it's unfair that her father is going to jail for such a long time for that, we can see that somebody going to prison in your family, that's never something that's easy to take in. And we can see how we can understand how she would have a hate relationship with weed, how she doesn't want to be dealing with anybody who does do weed or somebody who sells it, because it's already taken her father away from her. And, the film doesn't really go into dramatic depths about it because, of course, it's a comedy at the end of the day. And yes, we get some good laughs. From other scenes and other scenarios, but Mary Jane is dealing with having to see a parent that went to jail over marijuana. And, she likes Thurgood and she has interest in him, but she wants to know, what's more important? Is it me or is it the weed? And sometimes it comes down to the ultimatum. It's kind of like that show Intervention on A&E, where like these people have these certain addictions. Like it not just to drugs, but hey, maybe this person plays video games too much, or maybe this person like has this kind of behavior that's affecting other family members, and these family members come in and have an intervention, so to speak, like sit them down and talk to them and tell them, hey, this is how your addiction, this is how your problem is affecting us, and we want you to get help, not because we want to put you on the spot, but because we love you and we don't want to see anything happen to you. And like I said before, I mean, weed, for the most part, I have not seen it to be such a dangerous drug, but I could understand that if the person you care about, the person who loves you, has been affected badly by it and they see you doing it, I could see how a person would be like, hey, it's either me or the weed. And yeah, it kind of puts you in a situation to where you have to make that choice. And what's more important? Is it, getting high, or is it experiencing the love of your close ones?
Yeah, I want to jump in and kind of respond to that, because Mary Jane's arc is kind of really where I felt most connected to from a personal standpoint. But we're going to take a quick commercial break, and we'll be right back. If you or someone you know is listening to this podcast right now, and you're struggling with suicide, addiction, self-harm, or depression, we encourage you guys to please reach out. This is the heartbeat of why we do what we do. Suicide is currently the 10th leading cause of death in the United States, and as of this recording, there are 132 suicides that take place each and every day on American soil. And when you scale back internationally, there are 800,000 successful suicides. That is one death roughly every 40 seconds. So if you or someone you know is struggling, you guys can go to victimsandvillains.net/hope. That resource is going to be right in the description wherever you guys are currently listening or streaming this. There you'll find resources that include the National Suicide Lifeline, which is 1-800-273-8255. You can also text HELP to 741-741. We also have a plethora of other resources, including churches, getting connected with counselors, LGBT resources like the Trevor Project, and also veteran hotline as well. Please, if you hear nothing else in the show, understand that you listening to this right now, have value and worth. We get it. Suicide, depression, mental health, these are hard topics, and the stigma around them doesn't make it any easier. But please consider the resources right in the descriptions below wherever you guys are listening, because once again, you have value and you have worth. So please stay with us. For me, as I've said in the beginning of the show, like, I've experienced my own issues secondhand with weed because it has become a gateway drug. And I know it's really easy to talk about it in these like PSAs or even in this comedy where she says it so matter-of-factly, and it's not that way for everyone. And I've come to realize that and come to know that. But, everyone reacts to marijuana differently than other people. Everyone's going to react differently to anything, when it comes down to boil down to it. But for her, like we were saying before the commercial break, she's had this really bad experience with family, and she has this just disgust, really, of marijuana and drugs, period, and those that specifically deal in that. And I feel like I can't fault her as a viewer for that, because I know that fear, and I know that not to that degree, but like I said, like I've had people very close to me that have gone through almost very similar stuff, and it's really terrifying, and it's really turned me off from wanting to just have anything to do personally with weed or heavy drinking or just a number of other things. As we've been sitting here recording, like I've been drinking a hard seltzer. So clearly have no problem with alcohol. But for her, like she's had this personal experience and this personal tide. She doesn't, I guess, want to go through that hurt again. And like I was saying before, like, addictions that if, can get out of hands if we're not careful, or if we don't acknowledge that we need help, they can hurt those closest to us.
I mean, you said it perfectly. I kind of wanted to switch gears and get into one issue I had with the film, just one issue. And, outside of, just the comedy and everything, I always wonder, why is there a double standard when it comes to jokes about, sexual assault and rape when it comes to men in film? We talk about how, films like Promising Young Woman, they really talk about how, women, they deal with this rape culture, where women are sexualized and everything, and they're just expected to give up their goods to men and everything. And if not, then they need to shut up and stay in their own place if they, fight against that. And we know that in a film, it's not in good taste to make any joke involving sexual assault or rape when it comes to women in the characters in the film. But in this film, we see that the character of I think it's Harry. I think once he goes to jail, we see that there's these constant jokes of him like dropping the soap in the shower, and like this guy, like once the character of Squirrel leaves jail, then this guy is going to come and like make him his boyfriend and like try to like sexually assault him or rape him. That's what's implied. And I kind of just don't like how there's a double standard with that. Like, if it's a male character, then it's seen as funny. It's a great joke. But if it's a female character, then they're shock and awe. And I think there has to be awareness on both sides that it's not cool to have men painted as being victims of sexual assault and rape.
100% agree. And it's interesting because, to kind of switch mediums, back in the early 2000s, there was a comic with Dick Grayson, who has mostly known as Robin, but in his Nightwing series was actually raped in a panel. And, the writer of that comic has gone on record in saying that, it's one of the biggest regrets that I have as a writer. Like, I don't understand why I did it. And it's like, no, I think you're actually in the right, because it's one of the very first times that I've seen in any medium a male getting raped. Because I think when you talk about rape or sexual assault, it's automatically interchangeable that it has to be a female. So statistically speaking, according to RAINN.org, 1 out of every 6 American women has been a victim of an attempted or completed rape in her lifetime. That is 14.8% completed and 2.8% attempted. And then you look at men and boys also being affected. Non-students in college, there is 1. But if you are in college, you raise your risk of being sexually assaulted by 5 times. It says as of 1998, 2.78 million men in the U.S. have been victims of attempted or completed rape. About 3% of American men, or 1 in 33%, have experienced an attempted or completed rape in their lifetime. 1 out of every 10 rape victims are male. And to your point about it being this double standard, it's because we are uneducated, for one, and 2, we often kind of deflect how we're really feeling. And that, to me, I feel like is the biggest crime of all, because we could wipe both of them out if we just broke the stigma and educated ourselves and offered resources. So I just want to, before we continue, if there are anyone listening to this right now and you have gone through sexual assault, or you know someone has gone through sexual assault, we will provide links in the bio below wherever you guys are listening or streaming this episode. You guys can call toll free to RAINN. It's 1-800-656-4673. The number again is 1-800-656-4673. And I think to a degree, we, like I was just saying, like we think that rape and sexual assault, that it's interchangeable with women. And men, we make a joke of it. It's always kind of been that way for the longest time, and I think it's kind of that old way of thinking of, the domesticated roles of what a man is versus what a woman is. Is to a degree, I would argue that the reason that we still have that double standard goes back to that old way of thinking. How would you guys like to help us get mental health resources into schools, conventions, and other events? Well, now you can. Simply go to patreon.com/victims and villains for as little as $1 a month. You guys can help us get mental health resources into current and upcoming generations, educate and break down stigma surrounding mental health, suicide, and depression. And you get exclusive content that you can't get anywhere else. And you guys can tell us which Nicolas Cage movie you want us to cover, and we'll do it. All it takes to get started is to go to patreon.com/victims and villains, or simply click the link in the episode description wherever you guys are currently listening or streaming this episode. Pick your tier and get started today. Yes, it's that simple. So quickly select the tier that you want and help us get hope into the hands of the depressed and the suicidal today.
Hi, I'm Andy.
And I'm Masha.
We're a couple and hosts of the podcast Love What I Love.
We both love movies, but have very different tastes.
I love horror movies, but Masha will be the first to tell you that she is having none of that.
And I love a good rom-com, but could never convince Andy to watch any of my favorites.
So we decided to finally give each other's favorite movies a shot.
And share why we love them while diving into the process and the people that brought our favorite movies to life.
So please join us every other Monday as we take turns trying to convince each other
and you
to love what we love.
Love What I Love can be found on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and wherever you get your podcasts.
Tune in to see if I can get Masha to love the Warriors.
Or if I can get Andy to not roll his eyes at Legally Blonde.
We can't wait for you to join us, and if you want to share what you love, come find us on social media at LWIL Podcast.
See you there.
Yeah, I mean, and also it was just a time period as well. The late 90s, there were a lot of things, that haven't aged well about that time period when it comes to comedy. There was a lot of things that you could say and get away with when it came to comedy that you just can't get away with now. And for one, that's good because people are becoming a lot more tolerable when it comes to certain types of people in our society. But I also can see the other side of the argument as well. Comedians are not allowed to really have that full reign of just having the chance to be an equal opportunity offender, like a George Carlin or like early Eddie Murphy stand-up or like a Richard Pryor, or even a Jerry Seinfeld. And so for me, I'm bringing up the point because, I noticed that double standard is still going around Hollywood. But also, I kind of want to get your viewpoint on that as well. Like, where do you stand when it comes to the idea of comedy in a film? Do you think that it is, it's not in style to be an equal opportunity offender? Or do you agree with how comedy has kind of become a lot more politically correct?
I see the vantage points of both of them. And you're right, there are some of the things in this movie from a comedic standpoint that really have not aged well. I think the ones that kind of caught me and made me laugh were the Dave Chappelle isms, so to say. The mannerisms that I grew up on with Chappelle's Show, to bring it back to the beginning of our conversation. And then you have the prison cliches as they're come to be known. And I think that there's a place and time for, us to kind of talk about these things. And, hold on. Netflix, one of the best stand-up specials, and again, this is coming from someone that does not like stand-up, but one of the best things that I've ever seen from any comedian in this new wave of political correctness that we've been experiencing has been Nanette from Hannah Gatsby. And if you guys have not seen it, it is an hour on Netflix. I promise it is worth every second. And basically she reiterates and kind of talks about how she dealt with, struggling in her sexual identity growing up, and kind of also how she was bullied and subsequently also assaulted as a extension of that bullying. And I think that jokes like sexual assault and even to a degree suicide, there are definitely comedies out there that have used suicide as a punchline, and those just don't age well. Like those kinds of things, and now even I would argue like sexual identity and gender identity, those don't have place in comedy. And it's very cringy to kind of go back and rewatch some of these films that to bring it back to Good Burger. I could definitely see the Mondo Burger heist scene where they're revealed to be in Kel in lingerie, how that wouldn't age well for someone today. For us who grew up on Kenan and Kel, we kind of see the comedy in it because it's bringing us back to the hijinks that those two characters got into during that series. But for someone that, is growing up in this new era, I can definitely understand. But I definitely, to your point, I think that those types of conversations and topics definitely do not have a place within comedy.
Yeah, and also, we might as well just talk about, given that whole situation of Harry being in prison, and these guys bailing it out, like, it was so ridiculous that the guy got a $1 million bail just because he fed like a diabetic horse all of this food, and the horse ended up dying. It's like, it was so weird, but yet there's also like a tinge of kind of like social commentary in there as well. And that's a thing that Dave Chappelle is known for. He drips a lot of social commentary in the form of just laugh out loud humor. Like, you'll find yourself laughing at his jokes and his bits and stuff, but at the end of the day, you can always go back and find a little bit of relevance to the way society works, and to his disregard, and to his kind of like, he's very upset about the way that certain things in society work, some of the institutions. And I love, you actually brought this up to me in a personal message last night when you had watched the film about the end credit scene. I was watching it with my girlfriend. I was telling her, hey, there's an end credit scene right here. And, it shows Dave Chappelle sitting on a couch with kids and the other supporting cast members. They're like, hey, if you want to learn about weed and other drugs, go down to your local library. And, that goes to show us that, hey, it's all about research and really figuring and really trying to get information for ourselves, and not allowing us to just listen to what other people are saying about things. Because, hey, what's better than learning something new for ourselves instead of just like relying on certain institutions and news channels who may have a bias and who want to give you a one-sided view of a subject. There's no harm in somebody and a kid going to a library and learning about marijuana, maybe learning about cocaine, maybe learning about the effects of it, learning about, hey, like what this drug can do to you, and maybe understanding and getting a full spectrum look at what, these substances are. Because, it doesn't do any good to have people in fear about something. I've never understood why people use fear when it comes to talks about drug use and drug addiction. We live in a country now where people are willing, instead of helping somebody who is addicted to drugs, they want to put that person in prison instead of helping them out. Or we criminalize the people who obviously have a problem. Addiction is a brain disorder. Like, they have a problem. It has to be fixed. They need care and compassion, but instead we're willing to like tell these people that they're animals, that they're savages, that, hey, you are a problem and we don't need you in our society. Instead of us caring for you and giving you the help that you need, we want to throw away and we want to throw you behind the dungeon and lock it up and throw away the key.
Yeah, our response to the drug use in prison systems is interesting conversation. And like I said originally, like we're starting to digress a little bit and kind of not be as harsh as we kind of see or we have seen over the last 20 years. But then again, you're right. Like, to your point about the post-credit scene, it's something that is kind of made to be like a joke, but it's something that is worth noting because it's a real thing. Like, for me, like doing research, and also being around communities and people that indulge in weed for other things than just to get high, like, and escape, has kind of really changed my opinion on marijuana. And while I still am not curious enough to try it for myself, I am no longer this, cut and dry, like if you smoke weed, you're a bad person. Like, look, like I said, like, you do you. But it took me years of being around people like that and learning from those people and asking questions and engaging in conversations, getting into the right articles, and, just watching movies like Half-Baked and Pineapple Express, and, even listening to the occasional album or podcast to kind of change that opinion on it. And again, to Kales's point, like, do the research. Like, if you think, if you came into this podcast thinking one way about marijuana, I would challenge you, or even any other drug, I would challenge you to start to look at the effects that it has long term. Like, do the research, like Dave Chappelle says.
Also, man, before we end it out, I just want to bring up just the awesome celebrity cameos that are in this film. I mean, you already mentioned Bob Saget and Jon Stewart and Snoop's dog, but then we also have the great and immortal Willie Nelson. He has a great scene where him and Dave Chappelle are smoking, and then he asks Chappelle, like, how much does a dime bag cost? And then Chappelle gives him the price, and he's like, what? He's like, back in my day, a dime bag actually costs a dime. And then he also tells him, I mean, this is like another joke. This is like another joke that probably wouldn't fit well in today's era, but I found it pretty kooky. I mean, Dave Chappelle asks, and then, like, Willie Nelson's like, well, you know how much condoms used to cost back in the day? And Dave Chappelle's like, I don't know. He's like, well, I don't know either, because we never used them. Oh my god. And then the Jerry Garcia showing up at the end and kind of resolving everything with the situation between Durgood and Clarence, the rival drug dealer. Him just coming up as like this guy who's a form of magic, these magic beads, and he uses his guitar to knock out Clarence. I thought that was one of the best moments of the film for me.
Oh, 100%. 100%. I love the celebrity cameos in this movie, and there's a lot of like really quotable lines from this movie that really kind of allow this movie to move just past its themes, but to kind of grow in its cultural relevancy. In that regards, it feels almost kind of like a very like time capsule, but I love like a lot of the cameos, like you said, like we talked about Bob Saget, Willie Nelson. This film, I think, is definitely one of definitely the best movies I've seen as far as like stoner comedies go in all my time.
Yeah, I don't have much experience with stoner comedies, so I mean, I'm just going to go ahead and agree with you by default. I mean, I know that my girlfriend, she tried to introduce me to Cheech and Chong. I think one night we were on Hulu and we watched some Cheech and Chong, and I found it to be painfully boring and just unfunny. So yeah, Half-Baked would probably take the cake as one of the best stoner comedies I've seen. And also Pineapple Express. We can't forget about Pineapple Express. You mentioned it before, but I grew up on Pineapple Express. If nobody has seen that, I hope that this podcast along with recommending you to watch Half Baked, go watch Pineapple Express, man. It's such a great film.
Yeah, it's full of twists and turns, and it's wonderful. But before we get out of here, this is episode 2 in our Celebration of Diversity series, and we talked about this at the beginning of our Good Burger episode, but why is Half Baked important to black cinema?
Well, Half Baked is important because during the time, it was one of those films that was able to show people that there was a different side to marijuana, instead of just the whole propaganda is so evil and it will turn your kids into monsters kind of news that we were hearing. And also it introduced the world to what would become one of the greatest comedians of our times in Dave Chappelle. I mean, this is just his start. You know, he wasn't Dave Chappelle at this point, but this is just the genesis. This is the beginning of it. And I mean, also, it's a comedy. You know, I've talked about before in our reasons for starting this series is that we wanted to show films that didn't just deal with tragedy, that didn't deal with black people being slaves or being beaten and victimized, or just being in a downward spiral, not able to get out. Like, hey, black people can smile, black people can laugh, black people can share the same experiences that any normal person can. And I think Half Baked fits into that because it shows the black stoner. I think it was one of the first films that ever really went to that territory as far as a comedy device, and it did it well for its time.
Yeah, this is really the first film that really embodied that, because for so long, like, I mean, up to this point in the medium of film, if there was a stoner comedy that had come along, it was Cheech and Chong, or it was something that it was done on the DIY scene. It never really hit the cult status or following that Cheech and Chong did until Half Baked. And Half Baked has really grown in popularity since its release in 1998. You have, of course, Chappelle's Show that came out in 2003. Then, obviously, all of the years that Chappelle has done with Block Party, and all of the countless Netflix specials he's done as well, and stand-ups as well. And this film, I feel like, just really kind of gives you like you said, like a different slice of life through the stoner comedy. And I think Chappelle just has a very intelligent but like blunt sense of humor, and this film embodies that perfectly.
Yeah, man. I mean, if you want to check out Half Baked, I mean, it's not on any streaming services. I wasn't able to find it on streaming services. Well, it's on Peacock, but you have to subscribe to the premium side of Peacock if you want to see it without having to pay for a rental. And also, I mean, Peacock, I don't know, man. What unrelated, but what is your general reaction to Peacock as a streaming service? Because I found it to be hard, and their interface is kind of just not user-friendly when it comes to watching films and TV shows on there. And I haven't really gone to revisit it back since when it first began. But what about you?
All right, so Peacock for me is the equivalent to Tubi. I have to know what I want to watch before I get on the service. Because when we did American Pie a couple months ago, I watched it on Peacock, and it's the only time since they've launched that series that I've actually used it. I don't know. I'm not a fan of ad-supported stuff. Like, I will watch it if I necessarily like I really want to watch a movie. Like, I watched one today on Tubi, and I don't mind it. But again, like you have to know what you want, because again, you're just gonna be there for hours.
Yeah, I mean, I kind of did the cost analysis. I was like, okay, one iTunes rental for $3.99 versus me having to subscribe $10 to another streaming service. I mean, the choice is pretty easy. So, hey, if you want to subscribe to Peacock, then Half Baked is on there. But if it's on a rental, check out Vudu, check out Amazon, check out iTunes is on there for a good $3.99 right now.
Yeah, that's how I ended up watching it. I ended up renting it on Amazon as well. But let us know what you guys think about Half Baked. We're going to be posting a lot of Dave Chappelle stuff on our socials, so make sure that you guys follow us at Victims and Villains. But where can people follow you online, sir?
You can follow me on Instagram, Twitter, and letterboxd.com under the alias Black Nerd Magic. You can follow me on Facebook. My name is Caless Davis, Caless, last name Davis. And if you want to check out some of the work I've done for Victims and Villains, you can check out some of our reviews and past podcast episodes. And also check our friends from feelingfilm.com. You know, Aaron, he great podcast host, great friend of ours, and he's another great critic to listen to talk about film.
100% agree. I love Feeling Film. You guys can find me on Letterboxd and Instagram. It's at Captain Nostalgia, and you guys can follow us everywhere at Victims and Villains. We are on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, Twitch, and YouTube, and you guys can also just go to victimsandvillains.net where you guys can find all of those social links, as well as past episodes that Caless and I have done, movie reviews from both of us, and more talented writers, as well as you guys can also support us on Patreon through that website, and also at the same time, most importantly, check out our mental health resource library as well. But all of that stuff at victimsandvillains.net is going to be in the descriptions wherever you guys are currently listening to. Make sure that you guys hit that subscribe button, and have a great day. We'll catch you guys soon.